It's my pleasure to introduce our next speaker. This is the first time we've actually had the opportunity to have a genetic counselor speak at our family meetings. We're very excited that we were connected up with a very resourceful and exciting speaker. Carolyn Brown is a genetic counselor. She graduated from the University of Toronto in 2010. She generalizes in pediatrics and prenatal genetics, formerly at Cornell and Columbia in New York City. She has special knowledge in eye disorders and hematology. And just last year, she joined the Clinical Services Laboratory at Illumina, and she's working on whole genome testing and development currently. Welcome, Carolyn.
All right, good morning, everyone. I'm really grateful to be here with you this morning. So I was given the somewhat challenging task of trying to go over really an overview of genetic counseling for congenital disorders of glycosylation in 30 minutes or less. And this is really challenging because this is not a straightforward task, and also really it is unique to every family's a little bit different. So what I thought I would do today is really try to give you a high-level overview of how genetics and genetic professionals might fit into your child and family's care. A little bit about some of the common tests that are used in 2018, what is standard of care and what is coming down the pipeline, and really just try to give you a basic overview of some of what to expect, and hopefully sort of remove some of the mystery surrounding genetics, which I know can be a little bit of an overwhelming topic. So just a disclosure, I am a full-time salaried employee of Illumina. I'm not really going to be talking about that at all today. I'll go back to really where my heart is, which is working with families with rare diseases and achieving diagnoses for people with mysterious sets of medical symptoms. All right. So just to start off, really I think a lot of people have some misconceptions about what we can do with genetics, what we can't do with genetics, and oftentimes I think that doesn't really line up with reality, because there's a lot of sensational media coverage about genetics. So I think there can be a lot of confusion really around that topic. So I think the first thing to highlight is really that genetic testing is really just one of many tools that we can use in a person's medical care to really try to get as much information about that person's health issues as possible. Really, it's not all that much different than a number of other types of tests, such as x-rays, ultrasounds, biopsies. I'm really passionate about genetics because over time, and especially in the last decade, it's really been helpful in getting people explanations and answers much faster than they would have historically. But still, there's a lot that we really need to learn. So just to sort of give you a concrete example, is one of the questions that comes to me when working with families who have children and even adults with mysterious medical symptoms is, why does it take so long to get an answer, right? So a common story might be, and this could fit with CDGs, is you might have a baby who has some concerning symptoms. Maybe they're a little bit floppy compared to their brothers and sisters. They're not eating very well. They're not growing as fast as you might expect. And those sort of symptoms really spark off this whole process trying to figure out what the cause is. And I think often there's a lot of frustration as to, why can't we get an answer? Why is this taking so long to get an answer? So I think the first thing to point out is really that many of the symptoms, at least that we see in children with CDGs, is, they're very significant and potentially very serious, but they also, when we look at them from a medical perspective, they can have a whole host of causes. So it can really be hard to figure out, what avenue we should pursue. So is this something where, maybe they have some sort of infection, or did something happen in pregnancy? or is this something that is happening at a genetic level? And then if it's happening at a genetic level, we have 20,000 genes in all of our bodies. Which of those genes should we be looking at? So it's really a complicated process. And that's why it can really take time to get to a diagnosis. So, my area is genetics, and I think one of the key points is that over these past few years, this is really an important tool in getting, from the onset of symptoms to the diagnosis a little bit more quickly than we would have historically. So, I've worked with families where, you have adults with unexplained symptoms. It takes 20, 30, 40 years to get an answer. But now with the adoption of genetic testing, we're often getting to that answer much sooner, at least in many families. So just sort of the basic 101, really what genetic testing is it's used in a variety of medical situations. And the goal is really, anytime we see someone with a medical issue and we think, okay, this looks like something that is probably genetic, is to try to do a deep dive into the genome and figure out which one of those 20,000 genes is the gene that might not be working as usual and could be leading to those symptoms. So, an important concept, and I think, there can be a lot of confusion around this point, is that these are changes in your DNA that a person is born with. So you're not, if you have congenital disorder of glycosylation or another genetic disorder, this is not something that you get. This is something that is innate. It's something that you're born with. You have it your whole life, and it's not something that really you sort of develop. You may develop symptoms as you get older, but you have it from birth. So these genetic changes, they are either they can occur in a variety of ways. So most commonly, some of these changes are likely carried in completely healthy parents, and really it's just the combination or the chance of those genes coming together that can lead to the medical issue. Or sometimes you have a new change that can occur in either the sperm or the egg that's just random. And that change, then goes on in the embryo and the fetus, and then that child will have that change in all of their cells of their body for life. So we're looking for those. So usually, if you go through the genetic testing process, if we get a slam dunk and find the answer, you only need to really go through that process once. But often we're not able to get a clear diagnosis, and in that case, it might be useful to revisit the genetic process, as technology gets better and better. Another key point is that there's not really a one-size-fits-all approach to genetic testing. So what the right genetic test might be in one child is not going to be necessarily the best approach in another child. So it's hard to give sort of that concrete information. Really, that's something that, when you work with a genetics team, so usually a medical geneticist and a genetic counselor will really be looking at your family and your child's situation, looking at the medical issues. On our side, it's our job to figure out, which labs and, which experts might be the best person to look at your child's sample, and then to help navigate some of the more practical but very real challenges like insurance coverage and, can we get this covered by insurance or can we not, and navigating through, some of those sort of real practical challenges. So I can't give a talk like this without giving, just a basic overview of genetics. And the reason I'm showing that this picture here that might look familiar from high school biology is to help orient you to the type of tests that your child might have. So just in a nutshell, and I don't think does this have a pointer? At the top, okay. All right, sorry about this, everyone. There we go. Okay. So this structure right here looks a little bit like a fried egg. This is a cell, so it's really the most basic unit of our bodies. And you've got in the center here this nucleus. So we're all made up of millions, billions of cells. In the center here, you see these structures that look sort of like X's. These are chromosomes. Basically, the take-home point about the chromosomes is that these are like packages, and they contain all our genetic material, or our DNA. So our DNA is wrapped around these structures, and you can see they're shaped like an X here, but really they come in pairs. So one of the arms will come from mom in the egg, and the other arm will come from dad in the sperm. So you get half of your genetic material from mom and half of your genetic material from dad. And often it's just chance, the combination of the genes and the chromosomes that can lead to a variety of genetic disorders. So then if you look in at a more sort of zoomed in level, this is the DNA, the double helix of the DNA. And then right down here at this end, you see these little letters, the A's, the G's, the T's, the C's. These letters represent the chemical building blocks of DNA. So this is the most fundamental unit of DNA. And this is important if you've had genetic testing to understand sort of what that test is telling you. So this is really all the levels. You've got the cells, you've got the chromosomes, which are the packages containing the genes, and then we zoom in at a higher resolution, and you've actually got these individual building blocks of our gene sequences. So the reason it's hard to give really specific information about congenital disorders of glycosylation or deglycosylation is that really that's not one single disorder. It is a whole family of disorders. So it's sort of like saying, somebody has heart disease. There are a lot of different types of heart disease that are all really different. So we have to try to zoom into the most precise diagnosis as possible. So what we do know is, and this number is actually up here out of date. We know there are probably about 100 genes and probably many more that if they're not working as usual can lead to this family of disorders. We also know that in a minority of cases, sometimes there are actually problems at the chromosome level. So maybe you have a little missing piece of chromosome or a little extra piece of chromosome, and that's disrupting some of the genes that we know are important for these processes in the body. All right, so just to back up, sort of the most basic reason to go ahead with genetic testing, and I'm sure many of you have gone through this process, is to answer in the first place, what is the cause of my own or my child's health issues. But that's not really the only reason to go through this process. So often, we know somebody based on a whole host of tests, their symptoms, their specific laboratory results. We may have a pretty good idea of what that person has, but even so, trying to find the underlying cause can help us treat that child or that person a little bit better, and it can also give more information for the family as well. So what we do know is that because not all CDGs are alike, if we're able to determine the precise cause and the specific gene, we're often able to anticipate certain problems that are risks that might present over time to give someone a better idea of the prognosis. And that can often lead to improved medical care because we're able to watch for, certain issues that we know should be on the radar. Something Dr. Lamb will be commenting on a little bit later today is gene therapy and where we stand with respect to development for those types of treatments in this, this group of disorders. It also can help us hook children up with the best medical specialists to care for them because often, there are people who have very specific knowledge, and until we figure out what exactly is going on, it can be hard to figure out, who should be part of a person's medical care team. And finally, and this is something that I think is often on the minds of many families with a variety of medical issues, is, how did this happen? And if I were to have more children, could it happen again? Or maybe you have other children at home and you think, okay, could they also have this? So genetic testing really is the prerequisite to family planning. So once you can sort of think of it as if we're able to find the genetic cause, that's like a marker that we can use in the family. And we often go back, and if we find a marker in a child with a genetic issue, then we can go back and look at the parents and say, okay, is this new or is it an inherited disorder? And that can help us give a couple the chance of having a second child with the same disorder. If there's an older brother or sister, we can also use that specific information and then go do a test in the sibling. Often parents, want to know with certainty whether or not a brother or sister might have the same disorder, especially if it's something that's relatively mild or may not become evident until a child gets a little bit older. And that is really only possible once we find the cause in, the first person in the family affected. Because without that, we don't know what we're looking for in other family members. Finally, and this is, I think, outside what we can cover in 20 minutes, is there are a whole host of technologies available to couples during pregnancy or even before pregnancy where you can test for genetic issues. And if that is something that a family is thinking about, really we need to know the cause at the genetic level before those technologies become possible. So often we have families who come to a genetics clinic. They know what their child has, the specific diagnosis, but then they think, okay, I'm thinking about another child. I might be interested in testing during a pregnancy or even before pregnancy, and that's why we start the genetic testing process. So, I'll shift gears now and just go over some of the common tests that children with many rare diseases might have. So, the first family of tests is a group of disorders here. Look at that pointer, whoops. Okay. So if you think back to the slide 2 slides ago, you've got these chromosomes, or the structures that contain all our genetic material. There are types of genetic tests that look at these structures. You can do the most basic type of test where you actually take someone's blood and look under a microscope and you can count them. So most people have 46 chromosomes. We would make sure that they're all there, that the structure looks as it would expect. That's the oldest, most basic test. There is also a newer test, and this is a very common test in children with a whole variety of developmental delays or medical issues. And this is often the first test, genetic test that children are having these days. So it's called a microarray. And what it does is it is similar in principle to this chromosome test, but it's done using a computer. So what it's really doing a deeper dive into the chromosomes. And what we can do is things that are too small to be seen by eye under the microscope, you can detect with this more advanced chromosome test called a microarray. Now, usually in children with congenital disorders of glycosylation, these first tests are usually not going to show anything because most types of this family of disorder are not caused by these types of DNA changes. Once in a while we'll find something, but usually these tests will come back normal. So this is often the first step in a workup. You go through this process, you have this test, most of the time this will come back normal, and then we'll think about doing some additional tests or doing a deeper dive into the 20,000 genes themselves. And this sort of next level testing is where we find the vast majority of DNA changes in kids who have congenital disorders of glycosylation. So that is in this box, and that's why I colored it in yellow. So if we see a child in a clinic and they've come from the metabolic specialist and they've done a number of specialized tests and they know exactly which enzyme is not working so well in that child's, in that child's body, then what we're able to do is do a very precise test where we look at one gene. This is called single gene testing. It's probably the most efficient and usually the most affordable option if a patient comes to us and we know from their medical team that they have a very strong suspicion about what's going on. So this is a great option when we're pretty confident about what a person has. Sometimes we can narrow it down to a few genes. So we know they've got, a certain presentation. It fits in, say, more severe types of congenital disorders of glycosylation. Then what a genetics team will do is there are tests, rather than looking at one gene at once, they look at groups of genes. So maybe 5 genes, maybe 10 genes, maybe 50 genes. So rather than what we used to do sort of back, even 15 years ago is look one gene at a time, we would look at a group of genes together, and that's called a panel test. So that is a common test that many children with rare diseases will go through. And finally, there is a test that I think, at least in the genetics world, is getting a lot of press. It's called exome sequencing. And this is a test, I believe it's my next slide. Whoops, no, I will come back to that, where we look at all the coding regions of a person's genetic material. And that's a good test for when we know somebody, we have a strong suspicion that somebody has a genetic disease, but based on all the sort of routine workup, we can't say with a high degree of certainty what disease that person might have. So sometimes kids who have gone from doctor to doctor to doctor, we're treating their symptoms, they're doing okay, but we still don't know the root cause of that disorder. That is often when an exome sequencing test will be ordered. And right now, this is really the most in terms of widely available tests, this is really the most comprehensive genetic test that a person can have, at least in most situations. Finally, and this is actually the area that I'm working on now, there is a test that is in the pipeline, and it is available primarily through research studies called whole genome sequencing. And that is, you can sort of think of it as a combination of these chromosome tests to look at the amount of your genetic material, and then these gene tests that look at individual genes. And really what this test does is it's able to capture the types of genetic variants that we'd find with this family of tests and the types of variants that we'd find with this family of tests all at once, and some additional information. So that is a test. It's not widely available at most commercial labs. It may be available through some research protocols and a handful of clinical laboratories. But unfortunately, at this time, it's also not widely covered by insurance. So this is a good option. We'll have families who go through this family of tests, and we still don't have that proof of what they have. That's when this newer testing option may be a good choice. So, okay, there's my slide. So as I had mentioned, just to go back a little bit to the exome test, so this is a test, this is a cartoon here. These lines here represent our DNA. You've got these yellow bits here, and then you've got these white bits alternating. So what the important sort of take-home point from this slide is these yellow bits here, you can think of them as the really important parts. So what your body does is when it reads through the DNA to make the product from that gene, so the protein or the RNA molecule, these parts are usually discarded, and then these yellow blocks are linked together. Now, most of our genome is actually, you can think of it as these white blocks. So right now, we know it's not involved in making proteins, it's not involved in making RNAs. It may have other functions that we still don't know so well, but an exome test looks at all of these yellow blocks across all of our genes, 20,000 genes. So you can think of it, though, as when we look at an exome, this is an apple here and just one slice, it's about 1% where we have these blocks that we know are really important. So it's really only looking at this section of our genetic material, and then this part it's not, not evaluating so well. So if somebody goes through an exome sequencing test, and maybe we find no variations, Or maybe we find one, but we think it's a recessive disorder and there's something on the second chromosome. Oftentimes we think that it's in this part of the genome that we're not able to evaluate so well in 2018. Another point I want to make is, people will often go into the genetics clinic and say, I want the most comprehensive genetic test. I want my whole genome sequenced. And one point to make about that is that that is not always the best option in every situation. And in fact, it can often open us up to a greater degree of uncertainty and complication, which can be helpful, but also can be very anxiety-provoking. So one thing to think about is if we have a pretty good idea of what someone has, and we look at the one gene that we know is linked to that disorder, we're not getting information about the rest of that person's DNA. And when we look at a person's whole genome, we often can find other information. So you sometimes may get information back that is either unclear or that may have implications for other types of health problems different from the reason for why you're having a test. So for example, if, say we're in the situation where the medical team recommends an exome, one of the considerations is that you would have the option, there's a group of it's almost 60 genes now, where we know changes in these genes are linked to a variety of genetic disorders that we can manage and treat well, and people who have these disorders do much better with appropriate medical care. So that's something to think about whether or not you would want this additional information. So back to our examples, if you had a little baby who had low tone, not feeding very well, maybe a little bit slow to meet milestones, one of the things to be aware about and ask about if you have an exome is, will I be getting additional information potentially, say, about that child's likelihood of having, say, hypercholesterolemia or high cholesterol in adulthood, or increased cancer risks, or increased risks of certain cardiac issues. So that's something to think about, and often you'll have the option to opt out of that type of information if you don't want to receive it. So just a little bit of information about what happens once we have a sample that we use for genetic testing. So usually it's done on blood, although more and more we're able to do it on cheek swabs, which is much more friendly to a lot of our kids. So really the limiting factor, it's not generating genetic information, it's really doing a deep dive into these building blocks of the genome and trying to figure out what it means and if it's linked to the person's medical issue or not. And that is really, I think, where the challenge is right now in terms of genetic testing. So, and this is something, if you've gone through the process, I would encourage you to go back and look at any genetic test reports you have, because really it can give us a lot of information that can be quite useful. So what you'll see here is when you go through a sequencing test, the computer basically will generate this string of letters here, and these represent, again, the building blocks of the DNA. So you've got up here patient sample, and you've got down here what's called the reference sequence. So this is basically the consensus sequence of a particular gene that we know is the most common sequence seen in people without medical issues. So what you'll see here is at this one spot in the patient there is a G, and in the reference or the common sequence there is a T. So that's a difference there. So that, when we see changes like that and a person has hundreds to thousands of those, then the laboratory's job is to try to figure out what exactly that means, because not all of those changes really have any sort of effect on our health. Some of them might even be beneficial, and some of them can affect our, have implications for our health. So the first thing that a laboratory will do is when we look at this change at this particular site, we ask, okay, what does this gene do, and does this affect the gene's ability to do the job in the body in any way? So that's the first question. Something that we then do is we look in the scientific literature, and there are many of resources that we have available, and we say, okay, this is something we don't usually see in people who are generally healthy. We look in the literature and we see, are there other people who have been reported with this particular difference And then what were they like? So, there's generally quite an extensive process where the literature is reviewed, databases are reviewed, the laboratory looks at their internal sources of information, and we see if we can find the particular change in kids or adults with the same medical issue. And we also look to see, is this common in the population? So, in addition to do we see this, in people who may have health issues, do we see this in people who are healthy as well? And that might be a line of evidence that, maybe this change is not so important for a disease, or maybe it's having a minor effect on somebody's health and development. So one thing, and this is, again, a little bit challenging to cover in just a few minutes, is laboratories also have an evolving way of evaluating and assigning a score to these types of variants. So at one end, you may see on any reports you've had pathogenic. So if we find a variant, we say, okay, it's not present in people who are generally healthy. We see it in other people who have similar medical issues. It'll be classified as pathogenic, and that basically what that means is that it causes the disease. So this is sort of the most clear-cut answer. So that will give us generally, a definitive answer about whether or not a DNA change is important to someone's health. At the other end, it can be classified as benign, meaning it's not important. It doesn't really have a major effect in someone's health or development. And then in the middle, you have this area I just wanted to highlight called variant of uncertain significance. And this is important because often, and actually when we look at large sets of genetic data, this is the most common classification. So we'll often see a number of changes in a person's DNA, and we can't say, does it cause disease or is it benign? So often you'll have genetic test results where variants of uncertain significance will be reported back. And if this happens, these are sort of things to keep on the radar. And if you go through a genetic test and you get back this classification, we will often encourage families to follow up over time, because often as we learn more, as we get better and better at sequencing and we have more information, if something falls in this category, we can either bump it down and say, okay, it's actually not really that important, or bump it up and say, okay, this actually does cause disease. All right, so last slide here. Just some practical considerations for when you're thinking about genetic testing. So first of all, I think, in most cases, if you or your child is followed in a major medical center, you will have access to genetics professionals. I think in some cases, depending on your care team, it's helpful to be proactive and ask if this is something that, your child has a genetic issue, but you haven't gone through the DNA testing process yet, or you haven't been offered this. More so in sort of rural and remote areas, sometimes some healthcare providers may not be so experienced or up to date with genetic testing. So just to ask your physician and care team sort of what their comfort level is with ordering genetic tests and interpreting genetic tests, because it really is, it can be straightforward, but it is a specialized skill set. In general, medical geneticist, which is a physician with additional specialized training in genetics, and a clinical genetic counselor like myself, so that's a master's level trained professional with training in genetics and psychology, will be sort of the team that works together to guide you through the testing process. Another thing to think about is often, I think, this can sometimes be a point of frustration for families, is they're offered to enroll in research studies frequently, which is wonderful, but a number of these are genetic, and I've seen, at least in my own experience, many families getting enrolled in research studies relating to genetics and thinking that's the same thing as going through a medical genetic testing process, and it's not. So I think when you enroll in genetic studies, those are actually very important, because that's how we discover these genes in the first place, and that's where we gather a lot of the information, where we learn to classify these variants. But often genetic research studies, not all of them will return the results back to you. Some do, some don't. And some of them, if they do return them back to you, There are sort of different standards for research as opposed to, if we're using this information for family planning or for making decisions about how someone is treated. There are certain regulations that apply to laboratories doing that type of testing. So just be aware, research-based genetic testing is great. If you plan on using this information for family planning or testing, make sure it's done in a clinical lab. Just be proactive. I know some people get a little bit nervous about going to genetics. Make sure you understand what tests are being ordered, what gaps or limitations they might have, and what types of variants they might find, and understand that it often can be a stepwise approach to get to a diagnosis. And finally, I think this was always a thorn in my side when I worked in clinic, is insurance and genetic testing. So more and more genetic testing is being covered by insurance. I think some people assume it may not be, so don't sort of get the ball rolling. We're seeing that change really rapidly. Often, if it is covered, there generally may be some sort of hurdles you have to go over, like prior authorization or predetermination. A genetics clinic and a genetic counselor will be able to guide you through that process. And if your coverage is limited, they should be able to help you find a lab, say balance, the most economical approach with one that's likely to find the genetic issue in your family. And there are also, too, some philanthropic initiatives where people who have limited coverage for genetic testing or no coverage for genetic testing can get this at reduced or limited costs. So don't necessarily let that be a barrier to you. And if you do have concerns, I would encourage you to reach out to your insurance directly, because the last thing that we want families to go through is to go through this process and end up with any sort of surprise bills. So just to be proactive in working with your medical team to get that squared away as best you can. So I think my time is up. I don't know if we have time for any questions.
No, I think Carolyn is going to actually be able to stay through the break. Mm-hmm. So we're going to take any questions. If you have any specific questions for Carolyn, to go ahead and catch her after Dr. Miller's presentation. I want to thank Carolyn for coming today and for giving her time to us and for sharing a really great overview of a very complicated topic for all of us today.